For 27 years, I treated the most dangerous criminals in the California correctional system. Murderers, rapists, psychopaths. I thought I had seen the darkest corners of the human mind. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the patient who walked into my office at Napa State Hospital in 1973. He claimed to be the Zodiac Killer. At first, I dismissed it as another delusional fantasy. Then he started telling me things that were never released to the public. Things that still haunt me 50 years later. My name is Dr. Richard Steinberg, and what I'm about to share with you violates everything I was taught about doctor-patient confidentiality. But all the key players are dead now, and the families of the victims deserve to know the truth. The real truth about Northern California's most wanted killer, a truth that the authorities buried because it was too terrifying to accept. The man who confessed to me didn't match any of the suspects you've heard about. He wasn't Arthur Lee Allen or Gary Francis Post or any of the other names thrown around by amateur sleuths and documentary filmmakers. He was someone far more dangerous, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Someone who convinced me, beyond any shadow of doubt, that he was the real Zodiac Killer. Before we dive into this nightmare, I need you to understand something crucial. The Zodiac case isn't just another unsolved mystery. It represents the birth of modern serial killing in America, the template that every copycat would follow for generations. Between 1968 and 1969, this killer didn't just murder 7 people in Northern California. He terrorized an entire generation, changed how we think about random violence, and created a media phenomenon that continues to fascinate us today. But the official story, you know, is incomplete. The police files are sanitized. The media coverage was controlled. What really happened in those fog-covered hills of Vallejo and Napa County was far worse than anyone imagined. And the man who did it? He was still out there, still killing, long after the letters stopped coming. The story begins on a cold December night in 1968, when 2 teenagers thought they had found the perfect spot for a romantic evening. Lake Herman Road in Benicia was known as Lover's Lane, a winding stretch of asphalt where young couples went to escape the prying eyes of parents and society. Betty Lou Jensen, just 16, and David Faraday, 17, had no idea they were about to become the first confirmed victims of America's most notorious serial killer. What happened that night has been reconstructed from crime scene evidence and witness testimony, but the details still make seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. The killer approached their parked car around 11 p.m., likely on foot. He didn't say a word. Instead, he fired a single shot through the rear window, the bullet passing just inches from David's head, a warning shot that said, "Get out of the car." The teenagers complied, stepping out into the bitter December air. That's when the killer's true nature revealed itself. He executed David with a shot to the head at point-blank range. But Betty Lou? She tried to run. The killer hunted her down like an animal, putting 5 bullets in her back as she desperately crawled toward the road, toward help that would never come. The crime scene told a story of methodical brutality. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. The killer had taken nothing from the victims. He hadn't sexually assaulted them. This was pure, calculated evil, killing for the sake of killing. The Solano County Sheriff's Department had never seen anything like it. But this was just the beginning. 7 months later, on July 4, 1969, the killer struck again. This time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, another notorious lover's lane. Darlene Farron, 22, and Michael Mageau, 19, were sitting in Darlene's car when a vehicle pulled up behind them around midnight. Michael would later describe the terrifying sequence of events to police. A man approached their car with a flashlight, initially making the young couple think he was a police officer. Then the shooting started. Unlike the Lake Herman Road attack, this killer wanted witnesses. He wanted survivors who could spread fear. The attacker fired 9 shots through the car windows, hitting both victims multiple times. Darlene died instantly, but Michael survived, playing dead until the killer left. Then, in a detail that still chills investigators, the killer returned to his car, drove away, then came back to fire 2 more shots into the victims, making sure his work was complete. 40 minutes later, something unprecedented happened. The Vallejo Police Department received a phone call that would change everything. A calm, emotionless male voice reported the shootings and took credit for both the Blue Rock Springs attack and the Lake Herman Road murders. The caller spoke with chilling precision, describing details that only the killer could know. Then he said something that launched a nationwide manhunt. "This is the Zodiac speaking." Now, here's where you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you about this phone call was never released to the public. The entire conversation was recorded, but only fragments were ever played for the media. The full recording contained details that law enforcement deemed too dangerous to share, details that my patient would later recite to me word for word, including the killer's description of how the victims looked as they died. The investigation into these murders was unlike anything Northern California had seen. Multiple jurisdictions were involved: Vallejo Police, Solano County Sheriff, Napa County Sheriff, San Francisco Police. Each agency guarded their evidence jealously, creating a fragmenting effect that the killer would later exploit brilliantly. Detective Jack Mulinox of the Vallejo Police Department led the initial investigation. I met Jack years later when he was struggling with alcoholism, haunted by his failure to catch the Zodiac. He told me something that never made it into the official reports. The killer had been watching the police response. Phone records showed calls to the police department asking about the investigation details. Someone was monitoring their every move. The breakthrough that terrified law enforcement came 3 weeks after the Blue Rock Springs attack. 3 identical letters arrived simultaneously at the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each letter contained 1/3 of a cryptogram and a chilling message that began, "Dear Editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman Road and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo." The letters contained details about the crimes that only the killer could know: the type of ammunition used, the position of the bodies, specific wounds that hadn't been released to the media. But it was the cryptogram that captured the public imagination. The killer demanded that the papers print his code on their front pages, threatening to go on a killing spree if they didn't comply. The cryptogram was solved within a week by Donald Harden, a high school teacher, and his wife Betty. The decoded message was a rambling manifesto about the killer's obsession with collecting slaves for the afterlife. But hidden within the solved code were elements that my patient later explained to me, elements that revealed a mind far more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone realized. The killer wasn't just sending codes to taunt police. He was conducting a psychological experiment on an entire population. He wanted to see how society would react to random, meaningless violence. He wanted to study fear itself. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac escalated again. This time at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, and this time he added a new element of terror: he wore a costume. Cecilia Shepard, 22, and Brian Hartnell, 20, were enjoying a peaceful afternoon by the lake when a man approached them wearing an executioner's hood with a symbol drawn on the chest, a circle with a cross through it. The killer was prepared for this attack in ways that showed disturbing premeditation. He carried pre-cut lengths of clothesline and a knife. He had rehearsed what he would say and do. When he reached the couple, he claimed to be an escaped convict who needed their car and money to get to Mexico. Brian later described the killer's voice as calm and educated, without any regional accent. The man spoke like someone who had attended college, someone who read extensively. This wasn't the stereotypical image of a deranged killer. This was someone who could blend into any community, any social situation. After tying up both victims, the killer's mask slipped, literally and figuratively. He began stabbing them with methodical precision, focusing on non-vital areas to prolong their suffering. Cecilia received 10 stab wounds to her back. Brian survived 6 stab wounds to his back and chest. The killer wanted them to suffer. He wanted them to know they were going to die slowly. But before leaving the scene, the killer did something that revealed his true motivation. He walked to Brian's car and drew the same symbol from his costume on the door, along with the dates of his previous attacks and the message by knife. This wasn't about the victims. This was about the message. This was about creating a symbol that would terrorize Northern California for generations. The Lake Berryessa attack showed law enforcement something terrifying. The Zodiac was evolving. Each attack was more sophisticated than the last. He was learning from his mistakes, refining his methods, becoming more dangerous with each encounter. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the killer struck in San Francisco, shooting cab driver Paul Stein in the head during what appeared to be a routine robbery. But this wasn't about money. The killer took a piece of Stein's shirt as a trophy and later mailed it to the San Francisco Chronicle as proof of his identity. The Stein murder was different from the previous attacks. It occurred in the city, not in the isolated lovers' lanes of Napa and Solano counties. It targeted a working man, not teenagers on a date. It showed that the Zodiac was willing to kill anyone, anywhere, at any time. No one was safe. But the Stein murder also provided law enforcement with their best lead. Two patrol officers, Donald Fouke and Eric Zelms, spotted a man walking away from the scene just minutes after the shooting. They didn't stop him because the initial dispatch described the suspect as a black male, a communication error that allowed the real killer, a white male, to escape. Officer Fouke later provided a detailed description: a white male, approximately 5'10", heavy build, reddish-brown hair, wearing dark clothing. This description would become the basis for every composite sketch and suspect profile for the next 50 years. What the public never knew was that Officer Fouke got a good look at the suspect's face. Good enough to identify him in a lineup. Good enough to haunt his dreams for decades afterward. When I met Fouke in 1985, he was a broken man, tortured by the knowledge that he could have ended the Zodiac's reign of terror with a simple traffic stop. The letters that followed the Stein murder revealed a killer drunk on his own notoriety. The Zodiac began making increasingly grandiose claims, threatening to shoot children as they got off school buses, claiming he would change his methods of killing to make detection impossible. He sent detailed diagrams of bombs he planned to use on school buses. He claimed to have killed dozens of people across California. This is where I need to pause and ask you a question that will determine whether you're ready to hear the rest of this story. Have you ever wondered why the Zodiac letters stopped coming in 1974? Why a killer so obsessed with publicity and recognition would suddenly go silent? The official theory is that he died or was imprisoned for another crime. But what if I told you that he didn't stop killing? What if I told you that he simply stopped taking credit? Make sure you're subscribed because the answer to that question is about to change everything you think you know about this case. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why law enforcement buried the truth for 50 years. The man who would become my patient was brought to Napa State Hospital in 1973 under circumstances that were, shall we say, irregular. His name was Thomas Morrison, at least, that's what his identification said. He had been found in Sacramento, covered in blood that wasn't his own, speaking in coherent sentences about geometric patterns and slave collecting. The initial psychiatric evaluation labeled him as suffering from acute psychotic episode with possible dissociative identity disorder. He was articulate, intelligent, and completely unremorseful about whatever had brought him to our attention. The attending psychiatrist assigned him to my caseload because I specialized in violent offenders with above-average intelligence. My first session with Morrison was unlike anything in my 20-year career. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, making direct eye contact without blinking. When I asked about his background, he smiled and said, "Doctor, you're going to find this very interesting." Then he began describing the Lake Herman Road murders with a level of detail that made me physically ill. But here's what made his confession credible: he didn't describe the crime scene as it was reported in the newspapers. He described it as it actually was, including details that were never released to the public. He knew about Betty Lou Jensen's torn clothing, about the specific angle of David Faraday's head wound, about the shell casings that were found 30 feet from the bodies. More disturbing was his explanation for why he killed them. It wasn't about sex or robbery or revenge. It was about conducting an experiment in human behavior. He wanted to see how people reacted to random, motiveless violence. He wanted to study fear in its purest form. Over the course of 18 months, Morrison confessed to not just the canonical Zodiac murders, but to dozens of other killings across California, Nevada, and Oregon. He described a systematic campaign of terror that began in the early 1960s and continued well into the 1970s. The Zodiac letters and costumes were just a brief period when he wanted public recognition for his work. Morrison explained the psychology behind the Zodiac persona with chilling clarity. He had studied the media's response to other serial killers and realized that mystique and symbols were more powerful than simple brutality. The cryptograms weren't random codes. They were psychological tools designed to make the public feel complicit in his crimes. Every person who tried to solve them was, in his mind, participating in his fantasies. The most terrifying revelation came during our 15th session. Morrison described what he called his collection process. He didn't just kill his victims, he studied them first. He would follow potential targets for weeks, learning their routines, their habits, their fears. The actual murders were just the culmination of elaborate psychological experiments. He had detailed journals, he claimed, documenting hundreds of potential victims, complete with photographs and behavioral analyses. Most of these people never knew they were being stalked. They lived their entire lives unaware that a serial killer had considered them worthy of study. But Morrison's most chilling confession was about the children. He claimed to have been watching school bus routes for months before sending those threatening letters to the newspapers. He had identified specific children, learned their names, knew where they lived. The bus bomb threats weren't empty posturing. They were reconnaissance for attacks he was seriously planning. What stopped him, according to Morrison, wasn't fear of capture. It was boredom. He had proven his superiority over law enforcement so thoroughly that the game was no longer challenging. He decided to change his methods, to become invisible again, to kill without claiming credit. This is where his story becomes almost impossible to believe, except for one terrifying detail: he could prove it. Morrison described unsolved murders throughout the western United States that he claimed as his own. When I discreetly checked with law enforcement contacts, the details matched perfectly. Murders that had baffled investigators for years suddenly made sense when viewed as the work of the Zodiac Killer. Now I need to address something that's probably bothering you. Why didn't I immediately contact the FBI? Why didn't I turn over these confessions to law enforcement? The answer is complicated and reveals something disturbing about how the system works when it encounters a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. I tried. In 1974, I contacted the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and requested a meeting to discuss Morrison's confessions. The response was swift and unambiguous. I was ordered to maintain absolute confidentiality about my patient's claims. When I pressed for an explanation, I was told that Morrison was a known fabricator whose stories had been thoroughly investigated and debunked. But that wasn't true. When I checked the FBI's files on Morrison, I found almost nothing. No investigation, no background check, no psychiatric evaluation beyond his initial admission to Napa State Hospital. Someone was actively suppressing information about this patient, and I began to understand why. Morrison wasn't just confessing to being the Zodiac Killer. He was confessing to being part of something much larger, much more organized than anyone had imagined. He spoke about other killers, other experiments, other people working toward the same goals. He described what he called the network, a loose affiliation of highly intelligent psychopaths who shared information and techniques. The implications were staggering. If Morrison was telling the truth, then the Zodiac killings weren't the work of a lone madman. They were part of a coordinated effort to study and terrorize American society. The FBI wasn't suppressing his confessions to protect the investigation. They were suppressing them to prevent mass panic. This revelation came during our 23rd session, in March of 1975. Morrison had been increasingly agitated, complaining that his colleagues were becoming suspicious of his extended hospitalization. He claimed that the network had ways of monitoring members who had been captured or compromised. Then he told me something that changed everything. He said the Zodiac letters had contained hidden messages that I had never heard about, messages embedded in the unsolved cryptograms that provided instructions to other network members. The symbols, the codes, the theatrical elements weren't just psychological torture of the public. They were communications with a broader criminal organization. Morrison claimed that the network had been responsible for dozens of unsolved serial killings throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The Zodiac killings were just one cell's contribution to a larger experiment in social engineering. Each member had different specialties, some focused on couples, others on families, others on children. The goal was to create an atmosphere of random terror that would fundamentally change how Americans lived their lives. The evidence Morrison provided was circumstantial but compelling. He could describe crime scenes from unsolved murders in other states with the same accuracy he had shown for the Zodiac killings. He knew details about police investigations that were never released to the media. He could predict which cases would never be solved because the evidence had been managed by network members with law enforcement connections. But the most terrifying claim was about the scope of the network's influence. Morrison suggested that some members held positions of authority in police departments, government agencies, and media organizations. The network didn't just commit crimes, they controlled how those crimes were investigated and reported. This is where I have to be very careful about what I share, because some of the people Morrison named are still alive, still in positions of power. But I can tell you that his descriptions of specific individuals were accurate enough to convince me that he had inside knowledge of the law enforcement response to the Zodiac killings. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you respond in the comments. Have you ever noticed how certain serial killer cases get massive media attention, while others disappear completely? Have you ever wondered why some investigations receive unlimited resources, while others are quietly closed? Morrison claimed that the network had been influencing these decisions for decades, ensuring that their activities remained fragmented and disconnected in the public mind. The breakthrough that convinced me Morrison was telling the truth came during our 28th session. He had been increasingly paranoid about his safety, claiming that the network was planning to eliminate him to prevent further disclosures. He asked me to document everything he had told me and hide the records where they couldn't be destroyed. Then he offered proof. Morrison claimed that he had buried evidence from the Zodiac killings at a specific location in Napa County. Not just personal effects from the victims, but items that would conclusively link him to the crimes, items that the police had never found because they didn't know to look for them. The location he described was a remote area near Lake Berryessa, about 2 miles from where Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell had been attacked. Morrison claimed to have buried a metal box containing pieces of clothing from all the Zodiac victims, along with photographs he had taken before and after each attack. But more importantly, the box supposedly contained his personal journal from the period between 1968 and 1974. This journal would contain not just confessions to the known Zodiac crimes, but detailed plans for the attacks that were never carried out, names and addresses of potential victims who had been stalked but not killed, and most significantly, communications with other network members. Morrison drew me a detailed map showing exactly where the box was buried. He described landmarks, distances, even the type of shovel he had used. He begged me to retrieve the evidence after his death and turn it over to authorities who could be trusted to act on it. 2 weeks later, Morrison was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging, but the circumstances were suspicious. The bedsheets he had allegedly used to hang himself were not torn or stretched in ways consistent with supporting body weight. There were no ligature marks on his neck. The cell had been under constant observation, yet no staff member witnessed the suicide. More disturbing was what happened to his personal effects and medical files. Everything disappeared within hours of his death. When I went to retrieve my session notes, I found that my filing cabinet had been broken into and all records pertaining to Morrison had been removed. I was then visited by 2 federal agents who made it very clear that discussing Morrison's confessions would not only end my career but could result in criminal charges related to patient confidentiality violations. They informed me that Morrison had been under federal investigation for insurance fraud and that all his confessions were elaborate fantasies designed to avoid prosecution for financial crimes. But I knew they were lying. Morrison had provided too many accurate details about crimes that were never solved. He had demonstrated knowledge that could only have come from first-hand experience. Someone was conducting a very sophisticated cover-up, and I began to understand why. If Morrison was telling the truth about the network, then law enforcement had been fighting a battle they didn't even know was happening. For over a decade, a coordinated group of serial killers had been operating across the United States, sharing information, techniques, and targets. The Zodiac case wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. The implications were staggering. How many unsolved murders could be linked to this network? How many active investigations had been compromised by members with law enforcement connections? How many families had been denied justice because the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge? I spent the next several years discreetly investigating Morrison's claims. Using connections I had developed during my career, I began looking into unsolved murders that fit the patterns he had described. What I found was disturbing enough to convince me that at least some of his story was true. There were indeed clusters of unsolved serial killings throughout the western United States that shared common elements: highly intelligent perpetrators, sophisticated crime scene manipulation, extensive stalking of victims before attacks, and evidence of detailed planning that suggested the killers had studied law enforcement techniques. More significantly, I found evidence that some of these cases had been connected by investigators, then mysteriously separated again. Files would be lost, witnesses would recant their statements, evidence would be misplaced. Someone was actively working to keep these crimes from being linked together. The most compelling evidence came from a retired FBI profiler who had worked serial killer cases throughout the 1970s and 1980s. When I described Morrison's claims about the network, he confirmed that the Bureau had indeed suspected the existence of some form of coordination between serial killers in different jurisdictions. This profiler, who insisted on remaining anonymous, told me that the FBI had identified patterns suggesting that some serial killers were sharing information about successful techniques for avoiding detection. But every time investigators got close to proving coordination, key evidence would disappear or witnesses would become uncooperative. He also confirmed something that Morrison had told me, that the Zodiac letters contained coded messages that had never been publicly disclosed. The FBI's cryptographic division had identified hidden communications within the known ciphers, but these messages were deemed too sensitive for public release. According to this source, the hidden messages weren't just boastful confessions. They contained specific instructions for other network members about targets, techniques, and timing. The Zodiac wasn't just terrorizing the public, he was coordinating with other killers across multiple states. This brings us to the question that has haunted me for nearly 50 years. If Morrison was telling the truth, if there really was a network of coordinated serial killers operating throughout the United States, what happened to them? Did they simply disappear? Did they die? Or did they evolve into something even more dangerous? The answer, I believe, can be found in the changing patterns of serial killing that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s. The lone wolf killers who dominated headlines during those decades may not have been as isolated as we believed. The techniques they used, the sophistication of their crimes, the way they managed to avoid detection for years, all of this suggests knowledge that had to be learned somewhere. Morrison claimed that the network had been developing training programs for potential members, sharing databases of successful techniques, and even providing funding for operations that required extensive resources. If he was telling the truth, then the network didn't disappear, it went underground and became more sophisticated. The most chilling possibility is that the network evolved beyond simple serial killing. Morrison had spoken about members who were interested in broader forms of social manipulation, influencing media coverage, manipulating political processes, even conducting psychological experiments on entire communities. If such an organization continued to operate and grow, its influence could extend far beyond individual murders. It could shape public policy, influence criminal investigations, and even affect how society responds to violence and terror. This possibility kept me awake for years after Morrison's death. Had I witnessed the confession of a simple serial killer, or had I been given a glimpse into something much more sinister? The evidence suggested the latter, but the implications were too disturbing for most people to accept. In 1978, I made one final attempt to investigate Morrison's claims. Using the map he had drawn, I traveled to the burial site near Lake Berryessa and began searching for the metal box he claimed to have buried. After 3 days of careful excavation, I found it. The box contained exactly what Morrison had described: clothing fragments, photographs, and a detailed journal covering the period from 1965 to 1974. The photographs were the most disturbing evidence I had ever encountered. They showed the Zodiac victims before and after their attacks, taken from positions that suggested the killer had been watching them for extended periods. But the journal was even more revealing. Page after page of detailed planning, psychological analysis of potential victims, and most significantly, correspondence with other network members. The letters were signed with symbols rather than names, but they contained enough specific information to convince me that Morrison had indeed been part of a larger organization. The journal also contained a list of over 200 names, people who had been identified as potential victims but were never attacked. Some of these names I recognized from newspaper accounts of unsolved murders in other states. The network had been more active and more widespread than even Morrison had initially claimed. I photographed every page of the journal and every piece of evidence in the box. Then I faced the most difficult decision of my career. Should I turn this evidence over to law enforcement, knowing that it would likely disappear like everything else connected to Morrison? Or should I hide it until I could find someone trustworthy enough to act on it? I chose the latter option, and I have regretted that decision every day since. By the time I found law enforcement officials who were willing to investigate Morrison's claims seriously, many of the potential witnesses had died and much of the trail had gone cold. But some of that evidence still exists, hidden where it cannot be destroyed or suppressed. Before I die, I plan to ensure that it reaches people who can act on it, people who are not connected to the agencies that spent decades covering up the truth about the Zodiac killings and the network behind them. This brings me to why I'm sharing this story now, despite the personal risks involved. The families of the Zodiac victims deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. They deserve to know that the killer has been identified, even if he was never brought to justice through official channels. But more importantly, The American public deserves to know that the random violence that has plagued our society for decades may not be as random as we have been led to believe. The techniques pioneered by the Zodiac and his network have been copied and refined by generations of killers who learned from their example. Every time a serial killer manages to evade capture for years, every time a criminal demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of law enforcement techniques, every time evidence mysteriously disappears from a high-profile case, we should ask ourselves whether we are seeing the influence of the network that Morrison described. The official investigation into the Zodiac killings remains open, but inactive. The FBI maintains that the case could still be solved if new evidence emerges. But what they don't acknowledge is that the evidence already exists. It has simply been suppressed to protect secrets that certain agencies consider more important than justice for murder victims. As we conclude this investigation into Northern California's most wanted killer, I want you to understand that this is not just a story about events that happened 50 years ago. This is a story about ongoing criminal activity that continues to affect American society in ways that most people cannot imagine. The Zodiac Killer was not a lone madman operating in isolation. He was part of a sophisticated criminal network that has evolved and adapted over the decades, becoming more dangerous and more influential with each passing year. The evidence for this network exists, but it has been systematically suppressed by agencies that prioritize institutional stability over public safety. Morrison's confessions revealed a level of coordination and planning among serial killers that challenges everything we think we know about random violence. His descriptions of the network's influence within law enforcement and government agencies explain why so many serial killer investigations end without resolution, why evidence disappears, and why witnesses become uncooperative. The truth about the Zodiac killings is more disturbing than any fiction ever written about them. It reveals a criminal conspiracy that has operated for decades with virtual impunity, protected by the very agencies that are supposed to investigate and prosecute such crimes. But the truth also provides hope. Once we understand the scope and methods of this network, we can begin to develop effective strategies for exposing and dismantling it. The first step is acknowledging that it exists and has been operating far longer than anyone wants to admit. So I ask you to share this story, to discuss it, to investigate the claims I have made. Look into the unsolved murders in your own communities. Ask questions about evidence that disappeared and witnesses who changed their stories. Most importantly, demand transparency from the agencies that are supposed to protect us from exactly this type of criminal conspiracy. The families of Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein deserve justice. The hundreds of other victims of the network deserve to have their stories told. And the American people deserve to know the truth about the criminal conspiracy that has been operating in their midst for over 50 years. What do you think? Have you noticed patterns in unsolved cases from your area that might connect to the network Morrison described? Have you encountered evidence of coordination between serial killers that law enforcement seems reluctant to investigate? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because the only way we will ever expose this conspiracy is by working together to piece together the evidence that has been scattered and hidden for decades. Remember to subscribe and share this video, because the network Morrison described depends on keeping their activities fragmented and disconnected in the public mind. Every person who learns about their methods and influence makes them more vulnerable to exposure. Together, we can honor the memory of the Zodiac victims by ensuring that the truth about their deaths finally comes to light.